So today we have Bob Purvy. Apparently he wrote some book. Pen name, Albert Cory. The name of the book is Inventing the Future.
I'll be talking about that.
He'll be talking about that. And it's about Xerox Star, but it's a fictional story with real events. So without further ado, Bob Purvy. Everyone give him a big hand.
Well, thank you. And my book is available on Amazon, and I've got, I don't know, maybe 40 or so of them over there to sell after the show. And I also have a free giveaway of a paper I wrote on how to break up Google, in case you... Okay, so today we're going to talk about Xerox Star and personal computers, which we thought we were inventing. There were other people doing it, turns out. We'll get to that. The graphical user interface and Ethernet. We'll talk a little bit about Apple. And before I go any further, if any of you have questions, just raise your hand. We don't need to wait until the end. If it looks like I'm going to cover it later, then I might ask you to hold it, but feel free to interrupt if you want to. So this is a novel and not a history. So, by the way, don't you hate it when people put up PowerPoints and then read all the bullet points to you? I know I do. This is the last bullet points you'll see, though. So the first question is, why did I do this as fiction? Everybody, I'm afraid I might trip on my shoelace if I don't tie this. People write, most people, as nonfiction. And those books are out there already. An excellent book is Dealers of Lightning, and also Fumbling the Future. And I guess I wanted to put you in the story. You know, nowadays, if you read a history, you know how it turned out. And what I wanted to do was show the the subjective experience of being part of it when I was part of it. And the other reason is nobody remembers what they said back then. So if I tried to use real people, everybody would say, well, I didn't say that, or he wasn't there. So what I did is the events are all real, and I had Xerox people reviewing it and pointing out little things, especially when I talk about the Ethernet lightning outage. That chapter has been heavily, heavily reviewed. The next question you're probably wondering is, why is the book Albert Cory and not Bob Purvy? Purvy, you got to admit, sounds kind of like pervert, although I didn't hear that when I was growing up, but my niece did, and she said she couldn't wait to get rid of that name and get something else, and she's now Lisa Cory, and I thought, well, that's a good name, I'll use that. Albert actually is the name of my dad's brother, he got him a job at Swift & Company during the Depression, and he was killed on his very first day on the job. He fell off the scaffolding, or the scaffolding collapsed, I'm not sure which it was. So it's a different name, but it's still kind of in the family. The next, third and almost last PowerPoint bullet point is, can you buy my book here? And yes, you can. I've got them right over there. And it's going to be $10 just for you instead of $12.95. And the last question is, why don't you have more bullet point slides like everybody else does? And the answer is, I hate those. You probably do too. People say, oh, and then I said, don't want that. So mainly I'm just going to have pictures, and I'm going to free associate about it. And if you see something that sticks out, you want to ask a question, just raise your hand. So we started with the Alto, and you can see that this is about the size of a dorm room refrigerator. This thing folded down, and you put one of those into it. Those disks held about 2 megabytes, which is probably about 1/10,000th of what you have on your phone right now. You had the screen and the display, which, contrary to the practice at the time, was vertical. And the idea was it was going to look like a document and not like a computer screen. It was also black on white instead of green letters like everybody had back then. So it was pretty revolutionary. There's that word revolution again. see, any questions about this? I had one of these in my office. I mean, not exactly when I started, but had it pretty soon. Okay. So the thing that people think Xerox PARC is one word, but it's not. It's actually two words. PARC is right down the street here, and Xerox is the company. This is the building I worked in, and it's in El Segundo. How many people know where El Segundo is? Some of you, not many. It's near near LAX. It's a pretty short drive. People called it either Smell Segundo or El Smogundo. So the building was built in the 60s. You can tell because it's so soulless, black glass and steel. And it's the remnants of Xerox Data Services, Xerox Data Systems, which in 1969, Xerox bought the company Scientific Data Systems, and they ran it into the ground. They were trying to compete with IBM, which was always a losing strategy back then. But they had a time-sharing system, which I guess was pretty good. And in 75, Xerox got out of the business and laid off a lot of people. I think, by the way, there was also some sabotage. People didn't like being laid off, and security was fairly tight there. And a recurring theme in my book is that we made fun of the security people. They had all sorts of rules that didn't make any sense, like you couldn't bring your bike in the building. They would say, oh, well, that might leave oil and stuff around, and you couldn't argue with them. So that was El Segundo. Xerox, the Star product, at the time, this was 2 names before Star. It was called the Display Word Processor. Was going to be built in El Segundo, and the reason Xerox did that was because they thought, well, they have the expertise in building computers, and Palo Alto doesn't. Palo Alto is research. So when you hear Xerox PARC did this or Xerox PARC did that, it's not actually true. Our division was called the Systems Development Division or Department. I hope there's nobody here to correct me on which one it is. So SDD and PARC were administratively different. They only met at the presidential level. You're usually never, I think all the books I've read, they never talk about El Segundo. It's like it didn't exist, but it did. So we had one thing I wanted to mention was in Palo Alto, they built their own computer, which they called Mac-C, and that was considered kind of cheeky because Max Palevsky was the head of Scientific Data Systems, and C, of course, was for computer. There's a book out, which I've read, I don't know if you can even find it, called The Computers Nobody Wanted, by one of the old Xerox executives who hated PARC and thought it should be shut down. And he offered to get them a XDS machine. He thought, this is Xerox, we make computers. We're not going to let you buy a DEC machine. That doesn't make any sense. And they said, well, no, we need access to the ARPANET research community. So we need 10X. And they just built their own computer, and they called it Mac-C. So this caused some bad feelings. A lot of people thought, this is covered in my book, actually. A lot of people thought that the PARC researchers had their own agenda, and it wasn't Xerox's. Actually, they were right. Okay. So another thing about, I'm still not done here. Another thing about El Segundo and Palo Alto is Palo Alto had the beanbag chairs. A lot of people have heard about. There was like a remnant of the hippie days of the 60s, and he sat in beanbags, and wasn't that cool? And actually, they sucked. The time we went up there, you sit in them and you couldn't get out. You were like stuck there, and you couldn't see what else was going on. And pretty soon, the beanbags got retired. But actually, was there a rivalry? I don't know. I mean, we liked going up there. We loved it. We thought they were really smart people and really nice people, actually. They had some of their terms, which I cover in the book. One of them was the Millie Lampson How many of you have heard of Butler Lampson before? A few. Butler was like a god at Xerox. Whatever he said went. He's now at Microsoft Research in England. I've tried writing to him about my book, but he never answered. But he spoke very, very fast. So they had a term called the millilampson, which was a rate of speaking speed, where only Butler spoke at 1,000 millilampsons. Everybody else was slower. Okay, so the programming environment, I'll come back to this later. You hear about Jobs going to PARC and stealing what they had, and that part definitely isn't true. What he saw was the Smalltalk system on the Xerox Alto, and we were planning to build Star, or actually did build Star in Mesa, which I'll talk about later. So Smalltalk was considered to be a research language. It was my introduction to object-oriented programming, actually, although I don't think I never actually wrote a program in Smalltalk. But there was never, I'm realizing when I turn this way, you can't hear me anymore. There was never any intent to build Star in Smalltalk. But it was actually great for demoing concepts, and it was used for prototyping and all that. Mesa was what we're going to use for programming. That's what the operating system was built in. And Mesa was the only language that Star was going to support. I've talked to actually the Pilot people about that, and the issue of could a third party write code for the Star never even came up. You would think, duh! But then it was just assumed it was going to be a Mesa machine, and it would be turnkey, and the office worker would turn it on and never touch it, never go inside of it, and only Xerox would make software. One of the reasons I wrote the book this way is nowadays you can see, well, that was a dumb idea. But you know, there's probably a lot of things you're doing right now that are going to look stupid in 40 years too, right? If you say there aren't, you're probably lying to yourself. So in the book, the characters, they just say, oh, okay, well, it's going to be a turnkey system, and that's that. And you get to imagine what it would be like to be in that. And actually, people didn't even talk about it very much. People, yeah?
Well, I just was going to make an observation that I think...
We had a microphone for the audience. Do you better?
Sorry.
Okay. Just wanted to say, in many ways, I know that Apple has been almost totally a turnkey environment. And so, yes, there is a facet of people who do not want to necessarily have to understand the backbone of a system. They just want to use the system as it's given to them. But at the same time, it can usually end up being a stepping stone to more complicated thinking and more sophisticated thinking.
Yes, so now I don't have to ask if everybody heard the question because we have the microphone. Yeah, Dave Liddell, who was our head of Star, he says, well, there really wasn't an independent software industry at the time. There was, even for IBM mainframes, there was things like SyncSort, I think, and Total, the database. There was third parties that sold software, but nothing like now. As far as Apple goes, you know, what you said is true, but if you didn't have Microsoft Word, for instance, and Adobe and third parties like that, then it probably wouldn't have been as successful. So the other thing about Mesa is it was designed for a very low memory system. Mesa had opcodes. It had a virtual machine. You didn't compile it to the native hardware. And the opcodes were tuned, so they would periodically look at what Mesa constructs you were using and assign bit codes to those opcodes so that your memory was compressed. Well, nowadays, you know, when you have gigabytes on your smartphone. That seems kind of dumb too, but at the time, it was a reasonable strategy. So they did actually tune the opcodes on each release. And there's a part in my book later on where Star was supposed to run in 192K words, or 384K bytes of memory. And if that sounds like too little, it was too little, even for those days. So we were desperate to get an extra 64K words, and we finally did. And it was still too slow, but at least it was demoable. So that's Mesa. The structure of the language was kind of like Pascal, and the Apple Lisa, in fact, was in Pascal. Okay. Oh, yeah. I try to avoid hindsight in the book. Like I said, none of the characters know anything that they wouldn't have known at the time. But people did know about C, and they did know about Unix then. Unix, it was kind of dismissed as just a time-sharing system, which we don't care about. And C, this actually was on the door of somebody's office at PARC, saying C, all the control and flexibility of machine code, plus all the type safety and abstraction of machine code. So that was what they thought of C. Now, Charles Simonyi actually liked, let me back up a second here. The Alto software that was demoed was written in a language called BCPL, which I never actually used it. We were told not to use it. But it was a very, very low-level language, and C was kind of an evolution of BCPL, I think. Maybe somebody can correct me on that. So Charles Simonyi actually liked BCPL, and Ethernet. Let's go back a second. He liked BCPL, and there's a character in the book called Carol Molnar, which you don't have to think too hard to think that probably is like Charles Simonyi. I don't ever say that this character is that character, but Charles, actually I'm still in touch with him, and he gave me permission to use his story under a pseudonym. So I've actually asked him a couple times. He wanted to review what I said, and he never answered, so I guess he's fine with it. Okay. So the Ethernet was a big deal here. This is a big deal in my book, too, because it was pretty radical. You know, this was a time when if you got a T1 line from the phone company, it would cost you a couple $1,000s a month, I think. It cost a lot, and that was 1.5 megabits, I think. Did I have that right? It was not much, and within an office, you could get much more than that. You could have 3 megabits, which is what we had on the Ethernet. This picture was actually taken in the early 80s, but it's the only picture I could find where it shows how the Ethernet actually worked, where there was a transceiver and you attached it to the coax. There was a pin that penetrated to the center connector. And the critics of Ethernet, and there were many, actually. I cover this even more in my second book. A lot of people they called it a vampire tap to make it sound more scary. It turned out that I joined 3Com in '85, and already the vampire tap was gone. It was just the screw-in connectors. But at the time, it was like this. And people would say, oh, it's not deterministic. This happens in my book a lot. I have 3 main characters. One of them, Dan, is basically me, and I tell you that, so it's not a secret. That's Bob Metcalf, isn't it? Let's come back to that. The other 2 are completely fictional. One of them is Janet Saunders, who worked at TRW. Her husband works at Hughes Aircraft, and that becomes a bigger deal in the book because at the time, LA was an aerospace community. There was Rockwell, and there was McDonnell Douglas, and TRW, and the Aerospace Corp, and Hughes Aircraft. And almost everybody you met in engineering worked at aerospace, although I didn't. I worked at Burroughs. But Janet worked at TRW, and her husband's at Hughes, and he's happy there. And he wants to become a VP at Hughes and have a house and have kids, and she kind of not so into that. So she gets hired at Xerox, and she loves it, and I'm not going to give away the plot, but you can probably figure out what happens after that. So they have arguments when he says that Ethernet's just not going to work. It's not deterministic. This is the word that everybody threw at us, not deterministic. And Bob Metcalf, who you hear from back in the day, I'm still in touch with him too. He did the calculations and he proved that it would work. And we had it running at Xerox with hundreds of Altos doing file transfers and printing, and it worked. And this deterministic stuff was kind of a red herring. But Bob didn't believe it, fortunately, and he made a company out of it, and I even worked there for 6 years. Okay, this is one of Bob's original sketches of the Ethernet. People were more into things other than coax then, but you can see up there at the upper left, there's a bunch of Altos on the coax. I only knew Bob a little bit at Xerox. I obviously knew him. Yeah, question? Can you get him the microphone?
I just want to know, what do you mean by non-deterministic? Why is Ethernet non-deterministic?
I could probably ask 30 people in the audience to explain that, but since I'm the one up here. Non-deterministic means there's actually a section of this in the book where when you go to transmit as a PC on the Ethernet, you first check and see if somebody else is using the coax. And if they are, then you back off and you wait a exponentially weighted, hesitating here because I should know this, you wait some period of time and then try again. And it could be that when you try again, it's still busy and you still don't get in. So people would say, well, you can't calculate exactly how long it'll take you to transmit. In practice, though, it works. Nowadays, you have twisted pair Ethernet, which means there's a switch, which means that, actually one thing does anybody here know actually on a modern Ethernet switch whether you can still have contention anybody? Go ahead. You still can, but usually you won't, I think. Did I answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
But the problem you have is if you have two people who wait the same period of time, they can come back again and collide.
Yeah.
But each person has a MAC address. So you use the MAC address as a randomizer so you don't go away and come back and crash with the next guy.
Yeah, thanks. So I knew there was some randomness where it couldn't happen that you try and try and try and try and always fail. Anything else on Ethernet? It's kind of important. So when I started, it was 3 megabits, and they had a plan that it was going to be 20. That turned out to be 10. If Robert Garner was here, who volunteers with the center, he would tell you all about that. Ron Crane's wife, who I think is not here right now, she gave me permission to use this. So that's Ron Crane, who was the hardware guy who made Ethernet a reality. I didn't know him that much at Xerox. I knew him at 3Com more. Ron passed away in 2002, I think. And anyway, I just wanted to pay tribute to Ron because he was a great guy. Roseanne said, sure, go ahead and use it. I'm more worried that people will forget about Ron. So I'm doing my bit here that people don't forget about Ron. Okay, so the mouse, it was the other big thing back then that was controversial. The one on the left is the Alto mouse, which had by the way, I saw something on Reddit that claimed that the Star mouse was optical. It was not. It was mechanical, just like that. So the Alto mouse had 3 buttons, and the early Alto software used all of them, all in different ways. So it was a huge, huge controversy. How many buttons should the star mouse have? There were people who said, you got to have 3, and they would fight like mad, and this debate went on for months probably. And finally, Dave Smith, I recall, settled it and said, no, it's going to be like that. It's going to be 2 buttons. The left button is for clicking, and the right button is for extending your selection. Nowadays, that's not so common. Well, nowadays you tend to have a trackpad. At least my Mac here doesn't have a mouse, but for a long time you had 2 buttons like that, and you chord them, but all that came later. Okay, so how many people have heard of Charles Simonyi? 4 or 5. Charles is one of the more famous people that I worked with. You can see here on the right, he was, nowadays you hear about Jeff Bezos and, what's his name? Elon Musk going into space. No, it's not Elon Musk, it was, who's the other guy that went into space?
Branson.
What? Branson, yeah. Charles actually went into orbit. Those guys just went into suborbital space. So back in the 90s, I think, the Soviet Union was selling space flights for $25 million, I think. And for Charles, that was no big deal, so he went. At the time, Martha Stewart was his girlfriend, and she made some food for them to take into space, pack a lunch for his trip, you know. So the picture on the left is Charles back in the day. I worked for, well, I was in El Segundo, and Charles, of course, was up here. But I worked for him for 4 or 5 months, I guess. He was leading a project called Diamond, which was, I've said before, it was going to be a prototype of Star, and some people point out, well, we didn't have the hardware or the software, so how could it be a prototype? But that was my understanding anyways. They were working in Mesa, which Charles didn't like, and that made him kind of unpopular in Palo Alto. But I liked him, still in touch with him. He stated the Diamond project never had icons or the star GUI or anything like that. And I'm not exactly sure. I worked on a printing software with something called Press, which preceded Interpress, which preceded PDFs. I don't think I knew Geschke and Warnock then. Might have met them. So they worked on it for a while, and then Diamond quietly wound down or got killed. I'm not sure what. And Charles stayed there for quite a while. And I know he didn't leave until 81, I think. He joined with Bill Gates back when Microsoft was nothing, right? They weren't even public yet. And he told me he and Bill agreed to write Microsoft Word in C, which was anathema to the Palo Alto people. So you can see why he didn't get along with them. But anyway, he's a billionaire now, so I guess he did, and I'm not, by most of the people. All right. So, any questions about that so far? Mouse, Ethernet, Simonyi? Okay, so Pilot was the operating system that we used. I got actually a lot of help from Dave Riddell and Paul McJones in there. The others, still in touch with Hugh Lauer, actually, and Bill Lynch. So Pilot was, in my book, there's a character, Grant Avery, who's also fictional. He's not modeled on Wendell Schultz, who I barely knew. Wendell was the head of Pilot for about 6 months. And how are we doing on time, by the way? 2 o'clock. I should get going. But Wendell was the head of Pilot for about 6 months and kind of had no effect. They sort of ignored him. And that's what I modeled in my book, that Grant Avery is the head of Pilot and lasted about 6 months and they ignored him. But he's not based on Wendell, whom I didn't know well enough to base the character on. So Pilot was different from most operating systems. I already said that it didn't support third parties. It only supported Mesa. Their attitude to security was that it was more a matter of bugs than malicious actors. I know here again that nowadays we talk about internet security, but back then that was unheard of, and nobody thought we're going to have malicious people on the star that are going to be, so we got to protect against them. They thought it was more a matter of you'll have bugs and you have to protect against that. So that was Pilot. And a lot of what we did in El Segundo was create the functional spec, and I have one right here. You all can see it. It's pretty thick, right? There were 6 people that worked on it, 3 in Palo Alto and 3 in El Segundo. I'm in touch with at least 3 of them, maybe 4. One of them, David Smith, is the inventor of icons, believe it or not. Whenever I tell him that, he says, yeah, well, it didn't make me rich, did it? So, yeah, you can invent something really fundamental, and it doesn't mean that you're going to capitalize on it. So the fun spec was a constant debate. We were writing the code while they were writing this. I was involved with the records processing part of it, which was the database. As it were, it wasn't much of a database as the databases go, but it had an interesting UI, which was what we spent most of our time on. Star had icons, which is what Dave invented, and that was sort of a breakthrough too. You would do things like, it let him, the idea of this and the next thing, the keyboard, is you didn't need to read a manual to know how to do things. You could just figure it out. So if you want to know how to mail something, well, you move it to the outbox. And you want to know how to print something, you move it to the printer, or copy to the printer. By the way, move or copy was one of those things we debated all the time, is if you move it to the printer, does it go away? Well, no, obviously not, it better not. So you could put something in a folder and it would disappear and go into that folder, but it was still there. And figuring out how all this worked, and the next page, this was the Star keyboard. And I don't know if you can see this very well, but here on the left, there's keys delete, copy, move, and properties, and open. And the idea was any object that you have in your computer is represented by an icon, and you can do any of these standard operations on it. So you don't have to learn how to open something, you just select it and click the open button. And we spent like endless amount of time thinking about, well, what does move and open, copy, delete, and properties mean for records files? I think if I recall now, if you wanted to create a database, a records file, you could copy a document with a table onto the records processing icon, and it would analyze the structure and give you a record file that had that structure. So that kind of thing was what we spent our time on, not so much relational joins or inner-outer joins or any of that stuff. Although that was, somebody needs to interrupt with a question while I take a drink of water. Anybody? Nobody, huh? Oh, there's somebody.
So missing from that is any undo. Was there a kind of undo feature in this?
Was there undo? Yeah, there was, I think. Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was application specific. I wasn't actually expecting that. I think in a document you could undo things, but there were some things that are not undoable. And I think I would say we didn't really solve that problem. Okay, so this, but you don't need to read this. This is from the end of 1978, and you can see there's actually quite a few people on the star even then. The people in El Segundo are mostly on the right. There's me. Some of the people in the middle are also in El Segundo, mostly on the left. They're Palo Alto. Okay, so this is the picture that's on the cover of my book, although you might not recognize it. This character here his name is Jeffrey Smith, and he's the son of Dave Smith, who invented icons, believe it or not. And the story here around this is covered in the foreword, actually, which Dave wrote. The story is Dave's wife was pregnant. This was about 1980, I think, and she was 2 weeks overdue. They couldn't wait for the baby to get born, and they went to Xerox PARC, and they saw Maze War, which looked like that. So Maze War was well, I don't know if it was the first massively multiplayer online game, but it was certainly among the first. And she saw this eyeball there and was so shocked that the adrenaline rush caused her to deliver Jeffrey. So that's him. He's now older than Dave was at the time. So he's about 40. And this Alto is in the basement of a guy in Bothell, Washington. It's like northeast of Seattle. He was with the Living Computer Museum. I don't want to name him here because I don't want him to get spam mail, but he has 2 Altos in his basement, and they work, and this is the real Alto, or it is a real Alto working, and it's the real Maze War software. So on the cover of my book, which we'll get back to, the artist sort of did a stylized version of this picture. This was how you controlled it. This was the key set. You can look this up on Wikipedia, actually, the key set's out there. I picked the picture with the fingers. You could get an idea of the scale of it. The keys were clicky, and they actually gave you a click when you pressed down on it. And you controlled Maze War by, it was real fast, too. You're going left, right, left, right, left, right, forward, backward, and I actually didn't like it very much. It drove me crazy. But there was people who liked it a lot, and you walk around and hear people yelling when they just got killed or killed somebody. So you can see on Jeffrey's right hand, he's using the mouse, which is what you use to shoot somebody. And you could also look around a corner in the maze like that, where you could see the other players, but you could only, on the top here, you're looking down a corridor, and you could come to a corner and quickly peek around it and then get back again and hope that they didn't see you. It was too intense for me, so I played it for a few times and I gave it up. But I've actually talked, I don't know, how many of you play, what's the big online game right now? Anyhow, there's some game where you can have a mouse with 17 buttons and you can program them to do certain things. All right, so that's the star.
Just a quick comment, the undo button is at the top right. It's just above the red stop button.
Is that right?
On the right, above the red stop button. It's undo.
Oh. Yeah, my recollection is undo didn't work perfectly, but...
That aside, the button is undo.
Uh-huh.
And that was above the stop button, and it was there, so there was an undo button.
But there wasn't,
whether it worked or not, I could not tell you.
but there wasn't a redo button, though, which is the flip side, which nowadays you have. So this is the star how much time do we have? Another question?
I think they use the term again instead of redo.
That's right. Again. I don't know whether again worked all that well either, but it was there. Another question here.
Now that we're still on the keyboard, I do have something stuck in my head. I noticed that there's a button called Same. What does it do?
Same? Same was actually a really good idea. That if you might have gone to some piece of text in your document and made it bold and made it bigger and changed the font. And you could point to something else and say, make it the same as that. What's that? Again, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, we could just do the same thing using again, right? So why come up with a button, the key called Same? I mean, what does that mean?
Same meant copy all the properties as something else.
In modern apps, it was the same as paste format.
Right. But, I mean, in a lot of editors, you just do a repeat, basically doing the same thing.
So I think, if I recall, and I'm not an expert on this, we had a star in our office of General Dynamics in 1990 still, and nobody had ever used it as far as I know. But again, repeated whatever the last thing was you did, right? And that wasn't necessarily the same as pasting the format that you had copied, basically. So functionally, you can imagine they were different things, and you would want to have different keys for them.
When he's describing it discusses the real issue. I mean, for me, I'm constantly always doing variances of pasting when it comes to copying information from one resource to another resource. So yes, you have full copy with formatting. You can have copying without formatting, but using similar styles. And then you can have just text copying, which is basically just the text itself with no format whatsoever. In this case, I think what you're describing is the idea that, yeah, we had the copy function, but the copy was only going to copy the text itself and not necessarily the format it was actually written in. Then if you use the same button, then what you're doing is you're turning around and saying, not only are we copying what was previously typed, but we're retaining the same style and format that we wanted, that we used in the previous implement.
Okay. So this was an ad that Xerox ran, when we're at Xerox for all these years and we think, is the massive might of this company going to be brought to bear on our work? And we weren't really sure, but then they ran this in all the major newspapers and thought, okay, they're behind us. So this was, I have a little plaque actually at home, which I could have brought. I actually don't know if I have rights to this, but Xerox will tell me if I don't. I'll just take it down. So this guy inventing the wheel, and he's trying to explain to his fellow cavemen what this wheel thing does. And they're all going, wheel, who needs that? Okay, so in case you're wondering what I did on STAR, this is the paper I wrote as the lead author in 1982. It was in the first issue of the Transactions on Office Information Systems. Jerry Farrell's passed away, no longer with us. So that was what I did. And then about a year later, in '83, I left to join a startup, which you'll have to read my second book to find out how that turned out. Would you all rather ask questions, or would you rather hear a section from the Lightning chapter? Or would you rather just leave? Thank you. I thought you'd say that. So this is a chapter called, give me a sign if we need to stop. A chapter called Lightning Strikes. I was actually at Xerox when this happened. It was January 5th, 1978, and I'd totally forgotten it. I'm not sure I even heard about it at the time, but I was in El Segundo. Okay, Thursday, January 5th, 1978. Janet was visiting Palo Alto again, something she never tired of. Today, she was just supposed to check in with people and learn whatever she could about the Pilot operating system, the product hardware, Ethernet, user interface, and all that. In one of those magic changes of name that Xerox never officially announced, because that would let an enemy keep track of code names, the product was now called Star. She hoped she wouldn't slip up today and call it Janus. This time she took an earlier flight than she had been lately, the 7 a.m. PSA flight out of LAX. She hated having to get up at an obscene hour, but really if you took a more reasonable flight, you got to the office at 10:45 or later, and that made it a pretty short day. This morning, the roads were all wet and littered with tree branches and leaves. Apparently, it had stormed the night before. She first went to Grant's office to talk about the latest marching orders from corporate management. Janet was pacing back and forth, frowning, holding the base of the phone in his right hand and the receiver in his left. He glanced at Janet, smiled briefly, and motioned to the guest chair. "How much of the network is down?" The answer seemed to make him even more worried. "Does Michael know?" "Okay, I'll tell him." Michael is sort of the stand-in for Dave Liddell, who Dave's read this too, and he didn't object. So, who's looking into this? He wrote down some names on a yellow pad. Yeah, we have Peter McCullough and Bill Glavin flying out tonight for a demo. He stared at Janet, knowing he had just dropped the name of the chairman of the board. Janet knew McCullough was adamant that no exec would ever touch a keyboard. That was for their secretaries. The idea of an expensive computer like Star for knowledge workers, whatever that meant, was dubious for him. His rule of thumb was that you shouldn't buy a piece of equipment for a secretary that cost more than her annual salary. The execs were already a hostile audience. A bad demo was about the last thing Grant needed. "I'll let you get back to it. Keep me posted." He hung up and turned to Janet. "The entire Ethernet is down. Excuse me, but I need to work this out." He started for the door, then paused. "On the other hand, do you want to help out?" Grant strode briskly toward Michael's office with Janet trying to keep up. "What happened?" Janet asked. She had no idea whether this was a normal occurrence or not, but she knew bad things always happen at the worst possible time. It's life as an engineer. Naturally, if Peter McCullough is coming out, everything will fall to pieces. "No idea yet. They're looking into it." He knocked on Michael's door and entered without waiting for acknowledgement. "The Ethernet's down, all of it. Have you heard?" Michael didn't look worried. "Yeah, they're on it. Unfortunately, swapping out transceivers isn't fixing the problem. Usually that does it." He was thumbing through his Rolodex. "Didn't we have lightning last night?" Michael stopped flipping the cards. "Did we? What's that got to do with it?" Grant had no answer. "Don't know. It's just, that's not very common around here, is it?" "No, it's not. Anyway, the cable's not up on poles, Grant. Can you and Richard head over there?" Michael, of course, meant Richard Boddington, the guy in charge of the internal Ethernet. He surely needed to know about this if he didn't already. He wasn't in his office, and Grant guessed he was already on the case. He led Janet down into the basement, where Richard and 3 other engineers had gathered around a ladder, while another guy, Tim Field, stood on it with his head above the ceiling tiles. After introducing Janet, Grant said, "What happened? Anybody know?" Tim climbed down the ladder. "We're not sure. There's a short somewhere, but that's about all we know." Grant was growing impatient, but tried not to show it. Thinking, I could tell them Peter McCullough is coming tomorrow. That's what the executives in Dallas would do. But Palo Alto didn't seem to work on fear. These were smart guys who were used to finding problems together and fixing them. And if Tim was here, you already had the best possible engineer on it. There was nothing more to do right now. Richard clasped his hands. "Okay, Tim, what's the plan now?" "We're replacing bad transceivers, but there's more than one. At this point, I'm not sure how many there are." Got it. Does anybody have a theory on what happened? No one did. Grant asked, "Could the lightning strike last night have done it?" Janet had the impression they all considered this a dumb idea, but were too polite to say it. Tim finally said, "We're not ruling out anything at this point." Richard said, "Okay, we'll leave you to it. Janet, can you help out here?" Janet was thrilled. Grant and Richard left, and Tim climbed back up the ladder. He stopped and turned. "Janet, can you go over there and help Tony?" He pointed to the other end of the floor. "He might need another pair of hands." The 2 other guys walked in The two other guys walked off in a different direction, probably to do the same thing Janet was going to help with on a different part of the Ethernet. Tony was also up in the ceiling on a ladder next to a table with several transceivers on it, presumably bad ones. Have you ever attached a transceiver to the coax? Janet shook her head. Here's a quick lesson, demonstrating how to attach the clamp to the cable and screw in the pin that penetrated to the center connector. Here are some known good units, handing her a cardboard box full of Ethernet transceivers and other things she didn't recognize. You can find a spare ladder and flashlight over there in the closet, pointing to a room that looked like a giant broom closet. By the way, I think people have questions. We have about 9 minutes left. You want me to continue? You're dying to know what happened, right? Janet retrieved the ladder and a flashlight. Tony climbed down and was going to help her carry it, but she was managing. He gave her a diagram of the Ethernet on that floor. We know there are bad units between Tim and us because he's using the TDR. Time domain reflectometer, how does that work? Basically, it shows you where there's a short in the cable. Here's another one, showing Janet a large piece of equipment with an oscilloscope-like screen. He continued, Tim always says the Ethernet is like a string of Christmas tree lights. If one of them goes out, none of the others work. So you can't really tell if any are good after the break. I split the Ethernet here so we can find the bad transceivers from here on. What I want you to do is break it down there, and we'll just work on this segment. Tim and I could do all this ourselves, but we're under some time constraints. Janet thought she detected a smirk. Tony must already know about the execs coming. It looks like there's a junction over there by the wall, right? Janet glanced at the diagram. Yep. Janet took the ladder over to the wall, unfolded it, climbed up, pushed up the ceiling tile, grabbed it, and set it on the floor. She climbed back up and shined the light around, looking for a connector between two Ethernet segments. She found it, took a deep breath, and unscrewed the coax from each side. Then she yelled, "Ready?" "Thanks, hold on." A minute or so passed. Tony injected a pulse into the wire with his TDR and watched the results. "Okay, now what I need you to do is replace the transceiver closest to me." So far, so good. She studied his diagram and found the transceiver closest to him, which corresponded to someone's Alto. No surprise. The owner wasn't around, so she moved the ladder there, repeated the drill with the ceiling tile, and replaced that transceiver as Tony had taught her. Again and again, Tony had her replace all the transceivers on that segment. When she was finished, he said, "You did great. Now we'll clean up the mess. When we're done, we can reconnect the cable." By we, he clearly meant you, so she reconnected the network. She noticed that the cable on the far side disappeared into some kind of conduit. Thinking, this is the outside wall, nothing on the other side. She shined the flashlight around the wall and saw a metal conduit with the cable inside it. Then she saw a glint. It was something metallic that wasn't cable, conduit, or anything else legitimate. "What's this?" She had the person sitting nearby steady the ladder while she reached deep inside and retrieved it. It was a crescent wrench. "Maybe this was supposed to be here?" "Nah. The last guy up here forgot to pack up his tools." She put back all the ceiling tiles and picked up the little bits of debris that had fallen down. When she finished, she returned to the table where Tim sat. It had pieces of electronics, metal casing, and screws, and test equipment scattered around. And Tim was applying probes at various points on the circuit boards. All the bad transceivers had been replaced, and the network was back up. He gave a running commentary as he worked. As she approached, Janet heard, "Another bad input transistor." Tim gave her a startled look. Janet expected another assignment, but he just asked, "Where'd you find that?" pointing to the wrench in Janet's hand. "Oh, some tech must have left his tools." Tim paused and then resumed his debugging. "Thanks a lot, Janet." Everyone nodded. Janet walked back to Grant's office. Well, you have to buy the book to find out how it turned out.